Hello, my friends. Tonight's story takes us far back in time to an age before modern comfort, before paper itself existed, to discover what people once used to keep themselves clean and what that simple, private act reveals about the world they lived in. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story, and please write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see how many corners of the world join us for these quiet, late-night journeys. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a small fan for that gentle background hum, and let's travel together into the distant past. I am old now, and the world I knew has passed into memory like morning mist over a meadow. Yet certain things remain vivid, not the grand events, not the coronations or battles I witnessed from afar, but the small daily acts that bound all humanity together, noble and commoner alike. Among these, there is one matter so intimate, so universal, that it reveals more about the soul of an age than any chronicle of kings. This is the story of what we did when nature called, before paper existed to grant us the merciful veil of cleanliness. It is not a tale told in histories, nor sung in ballads, yet every man and woman who has ever drawn breath has faced this same necessity, and how we met it speaks to who we were. I have walked through many years and many lands. I began my days as a servant in a great Norman household, then spent decades in a monastery copying manuscripts, and in my later years travelled as a merchant's assistant from the cold shores of England to the sun-warmed stones of Italia. Everywhere I went, I observed. And what I observed was this: that dignity is not given by birth or station, but earned each day in small, silent acts of self-respect. Have you ever wondered what dignity meant when privacy did not exist? When the very notion of being alone with one's body was a luxury beyond imagining? Let me take you back. Back to a time when the word paper meant nothing to common folk, when parchment was dearer than silver, when even the wealthy hoarded every scrap of linen as though it were spun from angel's hair. I was not alive to see the grandeur of Rome, of course, but I have spoken to old men who learned from their grandfathers, who learned from theirs, and in this way the memory of things persists like smoke drifting through generations. In the great cities of the Roman Empire, they built structures of remarkable sophistication, public latrines lined with marble benches, holes cut into stone, with channels of running water flowing beneath. I have seen the ruins of such places in my travels, silent now, open to the sky, the water courses long dry. Yet once they were as ordinary as a well in a village square. Men sat shoulder to shoulder on those benches, conducting business, exchanging gossip, sharing the news of the day. There was no shame in this. The body's necessities were simply part of life, no more worthy of concealment than eating or breathing. And when the moment came to make oneself decent again, they reached for a tool both ingenious and disturbing to our modern sensibilities, the tersorium, or sponge on a stick. These sponges, I am told, were communal. They sat in troughs of running water, or in vinegar when water was scarce, and each man used the same implement that others had used before him. After cleansing himself, he would rinse the sponge in the water and return it to its place for the next person. Does this revolt you? It would revolt me now, perhaps. But I have learned that disgust is a luxury afforded by abundance. The Romans understood something we have forgotten, that water, flowing constantly, cleanses all things, that the sun purifies, that survival requires us to make peace with what is necessary. I have tried, in my imaginings, to picture what that felt like, the coolness of wet sponge against skin, the sound of water moving beneath stone, the voices of other men echoing off marble walls, the strange democracy of it all, that a senator and a labourer might sit side by side, equal in this most human of moments. The Romans brought this custom to every corner of their empire. In Britannia, where I was born centuries after their legions departed, fragments of their latrines still remain, half buried in hillsides, speaking of an order and cleanliness we would not see again for 1,000 years. But Rome fell, as all empires must, and with it fell the aqueducts, the public works, the notion that cleanliness was a collective endeavour worthy of engineering and expense. What came after was harder, colder, more solitary. What came after was the world I knew. I was born in the year of our Lord 1247, in a village whose name would mean nothing to you, tucked into a fold of hills in what is now called Gloucestershire. My father tended sheep, my mother kept a garden and brewed ale. We lived, as most people did, in a house of wattle and daub with a thatched roof that leaked when the rains came heavy. There was no special place for answering nature's call. At the edge of our property stood a rough structure, barely more than a wooden seat over a pit, enclosed by walls of woven hazel branches. In winter, the wind came through those walls like knives. In summer, the smell rose up thick enough to taste. We used what was at hand. Hay, most often, dried grass, sometimes moss gathered from the north side of trees, which was softer and held together better when damp. In the depths of winter, when the ground was frozen and nothing green could be found, we used straw from the barn, though it was coarse and scratched the skin. I remember the feeling of it. Hay is not unpleasant if it is clean and dry. It has a certain yielding quality, almost like cloth, and it smells of summer even in the darkest months. But it is imperfect. Bits of it cling to you. Seeds catch in clothing, and always, always, there is the knowledge that you must be thorough, for there is no washing afterward unless you walk to the stream, and in February that is a misery beyond contemplation. My mother taught me, as her mother taught her, to select the hay carefully. Not the coarsest stalks, but the finer grasses. Not the stems with thistles which could draw blood. She showed me how to bundle it loosely in my hand, how to fold it to create a softer surface, how to use several handfuls if needed, until I felt truly clean. There was no shame in this instruction. She spoke of it as she spoke of mending clothes or churning butter, another task required for maintaining one's dignity in a world that offered few comforts. The nobility, I would learn later, fared somewhat better, but not as much better as you might imagine. When I was 14 years old, my uncle secured a position for me in the household of Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville, whose manor stood 3 days' walk to the south. I went there knowing nothing of the world beyond our village, and what I discovered astonished me. The manor house was built of stone, with floors of oak and walls hung with tapestries. Fireplaces heated the great hall. Candles burned in iron sconces. To me, it seemed a palace worthy of kings, though I would later learn it was modest compared to truly grand estates. Sir Geoffrey employed nearly 50 souls, stewards and cooks, stable boys and laundresses, men-at-arms and craftsmen. I was taken on as a general servant, which meant I did whatever was required, hauling water, turning spits, mucking stables, and yes, attending to matters of cleanliness that noble folk preferred not to think about. It was here I learned how the wealthy answered nature's call. In the private chambers of the family there stood what was called a garderobe, a small closet built into the thickness of the castle wall, with a wooden seat and a hole that opened to the outside. The waste fell down a shaft into the moat below, or into a cesspit that would be cleaned out once a year by men paid dearly for their unpleasant labour. The seat itself was smoothed and polished. Beside it, on a small shelf, sat folded squares of wool and linen. Wool, you understand, was precious. It was England's wealth, our trade with all of Europe. Every scrap had value, but the wool used in the garderobe was of a particular kind, old fleeces too worn for weaving, or the scraps left over from cutting garments, saved and set aside for this purpose. Linen was even finer, old sheets torn into squares or undergarments too threadbare for further mending. The softness of linen against skin is a mercy I cannot adequately describe if you have never known anything but rough grass or tree bark. It is gentle, it absorbs, it can be washed, though few bothered with such labour. Lady Catherine, Sir Geoffrey's wife, had a servant whose sole responsibility each morning was to ensure the garderobe was supplied with clean cloths, that the seat was wiped down with vinegar and herbs, that a small brazier of coals kept the chamber from becoming unbearably cold in winter. I was occasionally assigned to this duty myself. I would climb the narrow stone stairs to her chamber, carrying an armful of wool squares I'd cut the previous day from damaged blankets. The garderobe smelled of lavender and rosemary, which the lady insisted be hung in bundles from the ceiling. Even so, the fundamental odour could not be entirely masked. Once I arrived to find several used cloths piled in a corner. Lady Catherine, it seemed, did not dispose of them down the shaft, but expected them to be removed and burned. I gathered them carefully, trying not to breathe too deeply, and carried them down to the kitchen yard where a fire always burned. As I watched them blacken and curl in the flames, I thought about the strange arithmetic of wealth, that a noblewoman could use linen once and discard it, while my mother would have treasured such fabric, washed it carefully and used it for years, that the same necessity united us all, yet the manner of meeting it divided us more surely than any wall or title. But even nobles, I would discover, were not the pinnacle of cleanliness and comfort. That distinction belonged to those who had journeyed farther than most Englishmen dared to dream. In my 23rd year, I felt a calling toward the religious life. Or perhaps I simply grew weary of service and sought the stability that a monastery offered. The reasons matter less than the outcome. I took vows at the Abbey of St. Albans and spent the next 18 years behind its walls, copying manuscripts and tending gardens, and learning that holiness does not exempt one from the body's demands. The Abbey was a city unto itself. 200 monks, plus lay brothers, servants and pilgrims passing through. We rose before dawn for matins, worked until vespers, ate in silence, and slept on straw mattresses in the dorter. The necessarium, as we called the latrine, was a long stone building adjacent to the monks' dormitory. It contained 2 rows of wooden seats, perhaps 30 in total, positioned over a channel through which a diverted stream flowed constantly. The sound of running water was our constant companion. Unlike the public latrines of Rome where men sat facing each other, our necessarium had each seat positioned in a small alcove, granting a measure of privacy while still maintaining the communal nature of the space. The stone walls were whitewashed, small windows high up let in air and light. In winter it was brutally cold, but in summer almost pleasant, cool and dark with the musical whisper of water below. For cleansing ourselves, we used water. Yes, simply water. Each alcove had a small basin fed by a lead pipe from the same stream that flowed beneath us. We would cup our hands, fill them with cold, clear water, and wash ourselves clean. This may seem primitive to you, or perhaps more advanced than hay and wool. I cannot say which, but I can tell you it felt, in its way, closer to grace than anything I had known before. Water is God's gift. It purifies. It renews. To use it for this purpose felt right in a way that wool and straw never had. The technique required practice. One had to lean forward carefully, reach behind, and apply the water with cupped hands. It was cold, achingly cold in January, when ice formed at the edges of the basin. But we were monks. Discomfort was part of our discipline, a reminder that the flesh must be mastered, not indulged. Some of the older brothers, who had travelled in their youth before taking vows, spoke of customs in the Holy Land and the distant East. They told of lands where water was the only method used for cleansing, where people would have found our hay and cloth as strange as we found their practice of eating with fingers alone, no knife or spoon. Brother Thomas, who had been on pilgrimage to Jerusalem in his 20th year, described how in the great cities of the Saracens, every dwelling had a pitcher of water placed specifically for this purpose, how people would pour water with one hand while cleansing with the other, never using any fabric at all, how they considered this method cleaner and more civilized than anything Europeans practiced. I tried to imagine it, a whole civilization built on this principle, where water was so valued and yet so readily used for purposes we would consider wasteful. But then, they lived in deserts and oases. They understood water differently than we did, we who had rain 9 months of the year, and took streams and rivers for granted. Brother Thomas also spoke of the public baths in those cities, where men would gather not only to wash but to conduct business, to socialize, to be groomed and massaged and perfumed. It sounded like Rome reborn, a world where the body was not shameful but simply part of existence, to be maintained with the same care as a good plough or a fine horse. Yet even in our monastery, with our running water and stone channels, we were not immune to difficulty. In times of drought, the stream slowed to a trickle. The channel beneath the necessarium would become fouled, requiring lay brothers to enter with shovels and buckets to clear the accumulation. I was assigned to this duty twice, and I will tell you plainly, it was the most wretched work I have ever done before or since. We wore cloths tied over our faces, soaked in vinegar. We worked quickly, trying not to breathe deeply, trying not to think about what we were shoveling. Afterward, we would strip naked and wash in the river, scrubbing our skin with sand until it was raw, but still feeling unclean for days. This too is part of the story, that even when systems exist to manage our waste, someone must do the managing. Someone must enter the places others avoid. Someone must make cleanliness possible for the community at cost to themselves. I left the monastery in my 41st year. The abbot granted me release from my vows due to my failing eyesight, which made copying manuscripts impossible. I was not bitter. I had learned much behind those walls, not least how to value water, silence, and the small dignities that structure a life. Unable to return to my village, my parents long dead, my siblings scattered. I found employment with a wool merchant named Robert Fletcher, who traded between England and the Low Countries. I became his assistant, helping to manage accounts and inspect fleeces, and in this capacity I travelled more widely than I'd ever imagined possible. In the winter of 1290 we journeyed to Bergen, in the Kingdom of Norway, to negotiate with traders who brought wool from Iceland and furs from the far north. The voyage itself was perilous grey seas that tossed our ship like a child's toy, winds that froze the rigging, and a cold so profound it seemed to stop time itself. Bergen in December was a town of wooden buildings and smoking chimneys, huddled against mountains that rose like the walls of the world. Snow lay deep in the streets. The sun barely cleared the horizon before sinking again into darkness. And here, in this frozen realm, I learned yet another way that humans adapt to necessity. The Norsemen used snow. Yes, snow. Fresh, clean snow, scooped up in handfuls, and used exactly as we in England used hay or moss. It sounds mad, perhaps, but consider, snow is abundant in that land for half the year. It is clean beyond anything else available. It numbs the skin, reducing discomfort, and when finished it simply melts away, leaving nothing behind. I tried it myself, out of curiosity and necessity. We were lodged in a timber warehouse with several other merchants, and the facilities were crude. A wooden seat over a pit in an outbuilding, with winds howling through gaps in the walls. A bucket of snow sat beside the seat, replenished daily by one of the warehouse boys. I reached into that bucket, my fingers instantly aching with cold. The snow was powdery and dry, not wet like English snow. I did what needed doing, and I will tell you, it worked. Not comfortably. My skin burned with the cold, and I shivered violently for minutes afterward. But it worked. I was clean. No bits of plant matter clung to me. No cloth needed to be disposed of. The Norsemen, I learned, had done this for generations. In the deep winter, when nothing else was available, snow served. In summer, they used moss, which grows abundantly in their forests. They preferred the sphagnum moss that grows in bogs, soft, absorbent, naturally antiseptic. Some families would harvest it in great quantities during autumn, drying it and storing it for the winter months when fresh moss could not be gathered. An old trader named Olaf, who had been making this journey for 30 years, told me that in his grandfather's time people also used smooth stones from the river, not to scrape, but to cleanse with water holding the stone underwater, then using it as a surface against which to wash. He showed me such a stone, worn smooth by centuries of hands and water. It fit perfectly in the palm, oval and flat, with no sharp edges. The thought of it moved me, that an object could be shaped across lifetimes for this single, humble purpose. That someone long ago had decided this stone was the right size, the right smoothness, and had used it so many times that it bore the imprint of human need. I asked Olaf if I might keep the stone, and he laughed, a great booming sound that echoed off the warehouse walls. He said the stone belonged to his family, passed from father to son, and would go to his grandson when the time came. But he found another stone for me, less smooth but still suitable, and gave it as a gift. I carried that stone for years, wrapped in a scrap of wool, though I never used it. It served as a reminder that necessity breeds ingenuity, and that what seems strange to one people is wisdom to another. From the frozen north, my work with Robert Fletcher eventually took me south and east, to warmer lands where the sun beat down with a force we English could scarcely imagine. We travelled to Flanders, to the great trading cities of the Rhine, and finally, in my 53rd year, to Italia itself. Venice rose from the sea like a fever dream, a city of water and stone, of canals instead of streets, of wealth beyond measure flowing through its ports from all corners of the known world. Here, silks from Cathay lay beside spices from the Indies. Here, glassmakers created objects of such delicate beauty they seemed woven from light itself. And here, too, I learned that the ancients' ways had not entirely vanished. In Venice and in Rome, where I travelled to see the ruins of empire, I met people who remembered. Old men whose grandfathers had worked on estates where fragments of Roman custom survived. Women who used methods passed down from before the church's dominance. One such woman was Juliana, who kept an inn near the Porto di Rialto, where Robert and I lodged. She was perhaps 70 years old, straight-backed and sharp-eyed, with hands gnarled from decades of labour. She ran her establishment with military precision, tolerating no drunkenness, no violence, no failure to pay. Her inn had a privy unlike any I had seen, not a hole in the ground, but a proper stone room with a seat that opened to a canal below. The flowing water carried waste away to the sea, and beside the seat sat a basket containing seashells. Shells, smooth, curved shells, each perhaps the size of a man's palm, worn down by waves until their edges were rounded and gentle. I must have stared, because Juliana laughed at my expression. In her heavily accented Latin for, I spoke no Italiano. She explained that this was the old way, the way her grandmother had learned from Roman days. The shells came from the beaches of the Adriatic. Each was selected for smoothness and shape. After use, they were washed in seawater and left in the sun, which cleansed them completely. She demonstrated, holding a shell in her hand to show me its curve, its smoothness, its perfect fitness for purpose. It was, she said, superior to anything else. It did not tear or scratch. It could be used hundreds of times, and seawater ensured it remained clean. I did not use the shells myself. Old habits die hard, and I remained loyal to cloth. But I marvelled at the ingenuity, at the way humans look at what nature provides and see solutions to every problem. In Rome itself, walking among the ruins of the Forum and the Colosseum, I imagined those public latrines filled with senators and citizens, all using their communal sponges, all part of a system so vast and so logical that its collapse sent Europe spinning into centuries of improvisation and discomfort. What arrogance we have, I thought, to believe ourselves the pinnacle of civilization, when those who came before us had already solved problems we now struggle with anew. The Mediterranean peoples also used something we in the north rarely considered: olive oil. After cleansing with water or cloth, they would apply a small amount of oil to prevent chafing and to keep the skin soft. This seemed the height of luxury to me, to use oil which we burned in lamps or used for cooking for such a purpose. But oil was abundant there, pressed from endless groves of olive trees, and what is scarce in one land is common in another. In Venice I met a merchant named Marco, recently returned from journeys so vast they beggared belief. He claimed to have travelled all the way to the court of the great Khan in Cathay, to have seen cities of millions, to have witnessed wonders beyond imagination. Many dismissed his tales as fancy, but I believed him, for he spoke with the specificity that only truth provides, and among his stories was one that pertains to our matter here. He told me that in the lands of the East, in Cathay and in the kingdoms beyond, people used paper for cleansing themselves. Paper, the material we in the West knew only for writing, so precious that a single sheet might cost more than a week's labour. They used it for this? Yes, Marco insisted, but not the fine paper we knew. They had invented a method of making paper so cheaply and in such quantity that it could be used for anything: wrapping, cleaning, even this most humble purpose. He said the emperor's court had paper specially made for the imperial household, soft and perfumed, but even common folk could afford rough paper for everyday use. I struggled to comprehend this, a world where paper was not scarce, where writing materials were so abundant they could be discarded after a single use. It seemed impossible, like tales of mountains made of gold or rivers flowing with wine. Yet Marco described it with such certainty. He said the process involved pulping bamboo or mulberry bark, forming it into sheets and drying it in vast quantities. That entire industries existed solely to produce this paper, that it was sold in markets like bread or salt, an ordinary commodity. He also spoke of another Eastern practice, the use of small vessels of water positioned at a comfortable height which could be tilted to pour water for cleansing, that people would use their left hand for this purpose, only the left hand, never the right, which was reserved for eating and greeting, that this was such an ingrained custom that to offer one's left hand in greeting would be a grave insult. I found this fascinating. The way that a practical necessity keeping one hand clean for eating could become encoded into social law, into the very fabric of manners and respect. How the body's needs shaped civilization as surely as religion or warfare. Marco also told me of public bathhouses in Japan, another island kingdom even farther east than Cathay, where people would soak in heated water together, washing before entering the communal baths. That cleanliness was not merely practical but spiritual, part of their religious observance. That they had entire rituals around washing, around purification, around the boundary between clean and unclean. I wondered what they would make of our English habits, of hay in winter and cold stone privies, of castles where waste simply fell into moats and festered. Would they think us barbarians? Would they recoil in disgust? Or would they understand, as I had come to understand, that people everywhere do their best with what they have, and that judging another's customs requires walking in their shoes or in their soil, under their sky, with their resources and their understanding. I have spoken much of nobles and monks, of travellers and city dwellers, but most people in this world are none of these things. Most are peasants, working the land, living and dying within a day's walk of where they were born. In my later years, after Robert Fletcher died, and I found myself too old for long journeys, I returned to the countryside, not to my birth village, which had been abandoned after plague swept through, leaving only ruins, but to a similar place, where I lived on the charity of a farmer's widow, who needed help keeping accounts and writing letters to her sons who had gone to London. Here, life was as it had always been, as it had been in my childhood, as it would be, I suspected, for centuries to come. People used what the land provided. In spring and summer, fresh leaves. Oak leaves were best large and soft, plentiful in every wood. Dock leaves too, which grew beside every path and in every ditch. The children would gather them as part of their daily chores, bringing back armfuls to dry in the sun. In autumn, when leaves turned brittle, people switched to moss and grass. In winter, whatever could be found, dried bracken, old straw, handfuls of wool if a sheep had died, and its fleece could be salvaged. The very poorest used stones, smooth pebbles from streams, or chips of slate, or simply their hands, and whatever water could be spared from the well. I watched a young mother teaching her daughter, perhaps 5 years old, how to select proper leaves. She showed the girl how to test them, crumbling them gently between fingers to ensure they were soft, not brittle. How to layer several together to create adequate thickness. How to be thorough, for cleanliness prevented the rashes and sores that could fester into serious ailments. There was tenderness in this instruction, pride even. The mother was teaching survival, passing on knowledge as her mother had taught her. This was part of the great chain of learning that binds humanity together, not Latin or philosophy, not statecraft or war, but the humble wisdom of staying clean, staying healthy, staying human in a world that offered few comforts. The privy itself was the simplest imaginable a pit, dug far from the well, a wooden seat, no walls. In summer, flies swarmed thick. In winter, snow drifted through the open sides. Privacy was not expected. Dignity came not from solitude, but from efficiency, from keeping one's face composed, from not speaking of it afterward. Have you ever considered what it means to live without privacy? to know that your neighbours can see you in your most vulnerable moments, that your children will grow up understanding the body not as something shameful and hidden, but as a simple fact of existence, no more worthy of comment than hunger or thirst. This was the medieval reality for most people. Not the castles and cathedrals we remember, but the mud and the cold and the constant grinding labour of staying alive. And within that reality, the daily act of making oneself clean was not a trivial thing. It was dignity asserted against a hard world. It was the insistence that we are more than animals, even when we squat over a pit with oak leaves in our hands. In the last years of my life, I write this now in my 78th year, my hands shaking with age but my mind still clear. I've seen the beginning of change. Paper, true paper, is coming to England. Not the precious parchment made from sheep or calf skin, but paper in the Eastern manner, made from rags and pulped fibres, produced in mills that are spreading across Europe. It is still costly, still too valuable for common use. The first paper mills in Italy and Spain produce sheets for writing, for the growing class of merchants and clerks who need cheap materials for accounts and correspondence. But I have heard rumours, stories of paper so coarse and cheap that it is used for wrapping goods in markets, of households that save these wrapping sheets, smoothing them out and storing them for secondary uses. And yes, of some who have begun to use such paper for personal cleansing. Will this spread? Will paper become common enough that every household can afford it for such purposes? I do not know. I will not live to see it, if it comes. But I think it will come. I think the future will look back on our time as we look back on Rome, marvelling at how we managed, pitying our primitive methods, perhaps not understanding that we were not suffering, but simply living, as humans always have, with what we had. I think about that young mother teaching her daughter to select leaves. What will her granddaughter's granddaughter use? Will there come a day when no child knows how to judge the softness of a dock leaf? When the skills passed down through countless generations become as obsolete as thatching roofs or grinding grain by hand? There is loss in every gain. Even as paper promises cleanliness and convenience, it severs us from the land, from the direct knowledge of what the earth provides. We become dependent on industry, on commerce, on systems we do not control. But perhaps that is the price of civilization, to move from the immediate and natural toward the manufactured and reliable, to trade the varied wisdom of adaptation for the standardized comfort of mass production. I do not judge which is better. I have known both worlds in my way and found dignity in each. Would you recognize civilization if it had no paper? I have asked myself this question many times in many lands, and I have concluded that civilization is not defined by its comforts, but by its aspirations. It is not the tools we use, but the care we take in using them. It is not the abundance we enjoy, but the grace we maintain in scarcity. I have seen nobles use linen, and yet treat their servants as less than human. I have seen peasants use leaves, and yet maintain a household of warmth and kindness. The means of cleanliness do not determine the quality of the soul, yet neither are they irrelevant. Every human being deserves the means to maintain their dignity, to keep themselves clean, to meet their body's needs without shame or suffering. This is not luxury. This is the foundation upon which all other achievements rest. When we mock the past for its crude methods, we forget that those methods worked. They kept millions of people alive and healthy across thousands of years. They were the result of careful observation, of trial and error, of knowledge preserved and passed down. They were, in their way, perfect solutions to the problems they addressed. And when we celebrate modern conveniences, we should remember that they stand on the foundation of all that came before. That paper mills exist because someone first learned to pulp fibre. That running water in homes became possible because Romans built aqueducts. That our notion of privacy emerged from centuries of living without it, until wealth and technology made solitude possible. Everything connects. Nothing is truly new. We are always building on what came before, even in matters so humble we rarely speak of them. I am old, as I have said. My travelling days are long past. I sit now in a small cottage on the edge of a village, tending a garden, writing these memories while my eyes still permit it. From my window I can see the church tower where bells mark the hours. Beyond it, fields stretching to distant woods. Smoke rises from cottages. Children play in the lane. Life continues, as it always has, as it always will. And every person in this village, from the priest to the swineherd, will today answer nature's call. Each will meet that need according to their means. Some with cloth, some with leaves, some with moss from the forest. Each will take a moment from their day to attend to the body's requirements, to make themselves clean and comfortable, to maintain that small but essential boundary between human and animal. This is what I have learned in my long life, that we are united not by our differences but by our common needs. That king and beggar alike must eat, must sleep, must empty their bowels and make themselves decent again. That how we meet these needs reveals our ingenuity, our resourcefulness, our fundamental humanity. There is no shame in discussing this. The shame lies in forgetting that we are all flesh, all bound by the same necessities, all deserving of dignity in meeting them. I think of the Roman senator sharing a public latrine with common citizens, of the Norman lady with her linen squares, of the Norse trader with his stone, of the Italian innkeeper with her shells, of the peasant mother teaching her daughter to select leaves, of the Eastern kingdoms with their paper and their water rituals, all of them, all of us, engaged in the same fundamental act of self-care, all finding ways to preserve dignity in the face of bodily necessity, all passing on knowledge, adapting to circumstances, making do with what the land and the age provide. This is civilization. Not the cathedrals or the castles, not the books or the battles, but this, the quiet, daily effort to be clean, to be decent, to treat oneself with respect even when no one is watching. Have you ever wondered what future generations will make of our time? What they will mock or pity about our methods? What they will have forgotten how to do because machines do it for them? I cannot know. But I suspect they will look back on us as I look back on Rome, with a mixture of admiration and incomprehension. They will marvel at what we achieved with so little. They will puzzle over why we did not see solutions that seem obvious to them. And perhaps, if they are wise, they will recognize that every age does its best with what it knows, with what it has, with what it can imagine. The story of how humanity kept itself clean before paper is not a story of backwardness or ignorance. It is a story of adaptation, of ingenuity, of the infinite variety of human solutions to universal problems. It is a story that deserves to be told, not with mockery or disgust, but with respect for those who came before us, who lived full and worthy lives, despite lacking what we now consider essential. There is one memory that returns to me often, especially now in my winter years, when cold settles into my bones and will not leave. I was perhaps 12 years old, in the depths of January. Snow had fallen for 3 days without stopping, and the world had become a place of white silence. Our privy, that rough shelter at the edge of the property, was half buried in drifts. My father had fallen ill with a fever. My mother tended him constantly, and the care of my younger siblings fell to me. Among my duties was ensuring the privy remained passable, that snow did not block the entrance, that we had adequate supplies of dried grass stored in the shelter. On the 4th morning, I woke before dawn to find my youngest brother Thomas crying in his bed. He was 5 years old, and he needed desperately to answer nature's call, but he was terrified of going out into the dark and cold alone. I dressed as warmly as our poor wardrobe allowed, 2 tunics, a cloak, rags wrapped around my feet beneath my shoes, and took Thomas by the hand. We stepped out into air so cold it burned the lungs. The snow came up to Thomas's waist. I had to carry him. The walk to the privy, normally a matter of moments, became an expedition. The wind had sculpted the snow into strange shapes that loomed in the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas clutched me so tightly I could barely breathe. Inside the privy it was somehow colder than outside, for the wind came through every gap in the wooden walls. I held Thomas steady on the seat. He was so small his feet dangled in the air, and waited while he did what he needed to do. Then came the matter of cleansing. A basket of dried grass was there, but my hands were so numb I could barely grasp it. Thomas's small fingers could not manage the task at all, so I did it for him, as gently as I could, though my hands shook with cold and I could barely feel what I was doing. When it was finished, we stumbled back to the house. My mother had woken and had heated water over the fire. She washed Thomas's hands and face, then mine, and gave us warm ale to drink. I remember sitting by that fire, feeling slowly returning to my fingers, watching Thomas fall asleep in our mother's arms. And I remember thinking, this is love. Not the grand gestures of ballads and stories, but this, carrying your brother through snow so he need not be afraid. Helping him with tasks too difficult for his small hands, ensuring he is warm and clean and safe. The daily acts of care, the humble services we render each other, these are what bind families together, what make a house a home, what give meaning to our lives. And years later, when Thomas died of the plague that swept through our village, this memory remained vivid, his small hand in mine, his trust that I would keep him safe, the cold that united us in shared misery and mutual dependence. This is what people forget when they speak of the past as a time of dirt and ignorance. Yes, we lacked much, but we had each other. We had the knowledge of how to survive. We had the willingness to help one another through the daily difficulties that life imposed. Would Thomas's life have been better if we had paper? Perhaps, marginally. But what mattered was not the material, but the care with which it was applied. Not the comfort, but the love that ensured even the humblest needs were met with gentleness. I've spoken much of my own observations, but I must acknowledge that the true keepers of this knowledge were women. Mothers, grandmothers, aunts, midwives. They were the ones who understood best how to maintain cleanliness, how to prevent disease, how to care for the body in all its vulnerabilities. Men might build the privies and dig the pits, but women determined what materials would be used, how they would be stored, how they would be applied. Women taught children. Women tended the sick. Women managed the intimate, unglamorous work of keeping a household clean. In the monastery, we monks had the luxury of established systems maintained by lay brothers. In noble houses, servants performed these tasks. But in common households, which is to say, most households, this knowledge belonged to women and was passed from mother to daughter in an unbroken chain stretching back to the beginning of time. My mother knew which leaves were safe and which caused rashes. She knew that certain mosses had properties that prevented infection. She knew how to dry and store grass so that it remained soft. She knew how often the privy pit needed to be emptied and which plants could be grown nearby to help mask the smell without contaminating the well. This was not written knowledge. No book contained it, yet it was as essential to survival as knowing when to plant crops or how to preserve food for winter. I think of Juliana in Venice with her basket of shells, selected and maintained with a craftsman's care. I think of Lady Catherine's servant, ensuring the garderobe was always supplied and fresh. I think of the Norse women harvesting moss in autumn, preparing for the long winter. And I think of my mother, teaching me to gather hay gently so as not to include thistles, showing me how to fold it properly, instructing me with the same patience and thoroughness she brought to teaching me to tie knots or plant beans. This knowledge is disappearing. As paper becomes more common, as systems become more standardized, the old ways are being forgotten. The daughters no longer need to learn what their mothers knew, because they can simply purchase what they need from merchants. Is this progress? Yes, undoubtedly. But it is also loss. The loss of self-sufficiency, of direct connection to the land, of the intimate knowledge of what nature provides. I do not sentimentalize this loss. The old ways were hard, but they were also complete. They made people capable, resourceful, attentive to their environment. They required knowledge that modern convenience renders obsolete. Let me speak briefly of the places themselves, the privies, the garderobes, the necessaria. For these structures too tell a story of human ingenuity and changing times. The simplest privy is merely a pit with a seat over it. This is what most common folk used throughout the ages. The pit would be dug deep 6 feet or more, and lined with stones if the soil was loose. The seat was a plank with a hole cut in it, smooth to prevent splinters. Some had covers to keep out rain and animals. Some had none. The great challenge was location. Too close to the house and the smell became unbearable. Too close to the well and the water supply became contaminated, bringing diseases that could kill entire families. Every peasant knew to dig the privy downhill from the well at a distance of at least 20 paces. This wisdom was bought with lives, with children who died from fouled water, with hard lessons learned and remembered. In castles and manor houses, the garderobe was a more sophisticated solution. Built into the thickness of stone walls, it allowed waste to fall straight down the exterior wall into the moat or into a cesspit below. This removed the waste from the living space entirely. I remember standing in the ruins of a castle near Durham, looking up at a wall where the garderobe outlets were still visible square holes high up, staining the stone beneath. Birds had nested in some of them. Ivy grew around others, but you could still see the ingenuity of the design, positioned on the north side where sun would not warm them, angled slightly outward so falling waste would clear the wall, spaced so that each chamber had its own outlet. Some castles positioned garderobes above rivers, so flowing water would carry waste away immediately. Others used elaborate chutes that directed waste into collection pits that could be emptied periodically. The most sophisticated had ventilation shafts to draw away odours, and niches where herbs could be burned to freshen the air. In monasteries, the architecture was often most advanced of all. The necessarium at St Albans was, as I have described, supplied with running water both for cleansing and for waste removal. Other monasteries I visited or heard about had similar systems: the priory at Canterbury, the abbey at Fountains, the great monastery at Cluny in France. These systems required engineering knowledge, investment of resources, and ongoing maintenance. They represented a collective commitment to cleanliness and health that stands in stark contrast to the common image of the medieval world as hopelessly filthy. Yes, cities were often foul, with waste thrown into streets and rivers choked with refuse. But within organised communities, monasteries, castles, well-managed estate systems existed to handle waste with remarkable effectiveness. The problem was that such systems required resources most people did not have. A peasant could not divert a stream through his privy. A town could not afford to build sewers. So people made do with simpler solutions, and the burden of maintaining cleanliness fell on individuals rather than institutions. This too is part of the story, that civilization is not merely about having sophisticated systems, but about who has access to them, that the same age can contain both flowing water and open pits, both comfort and squalor, depending on one's station in life. I must address directly a question that perhaps troubles you. Was there shame in these practices? Did people feel degraded by having to use hay and leaves and stones? The answer is both yes and no, in ways that are difficult to explain across the centuries that separate us. There was no shame in the necessity itself. Everyone understood that the body has needs, that these needs must be met, that this is simply part of being human. In an age where most people lived in small houses with many family members, where privacy was rare and bodies were regularly visible to others, there was less stigma attached to bodily functions than exists now. But there was shame in being unable to maintain cleanliness, in having rashes or sores from inadequate cleansing, in smelling foul because one lacked proper materials or water, in being seen as slovenly or careless about one's person. The shame was not in the act, but in the failure to properly manage it. This is an important distinction. People took pride in resourcefulness, in making do with what they had, in keeping themselves as clean as circumstances allowed. A peasant who carefully selected soft leaves and cleansed himself thoroughly had nothing to be ashamed of. But one who was careless, who neglected cleanliness, who allowed himself to become genuinely filthy, that person would be looked down upon. Dignity came from effort, not from material abundance. I saw this clearly in the monastery. We were all using the same simple method water in our hands, but some brothers were fastidious, thorough, attentive to cleanliness, despite the discomfort of cold water. Others were hurried and careless. The difference was visible not in what they used, but in how they carried themselves, in the respect they showed for their own bodies and the communal space. This principle applied everywhere. The noble who carelessly soiled her linen cloth and threw it aside for servants to handle was less dignified in a sense than the peasant who carefully folded her grass and disposed of it properly, even though one had fine materials and the other had only what grew in ditches. Dignity is not granted by wealth or station. It is earned through care, through attention, through the respect one shows oneself and others in the small, private moments that no one sees. Have you ever wondered what dignity means when privacy does not exist? I have pondered this question my entire life, and I've concluded that dignity is not about hiding ourselves, but about managing ourselves well. It is not about pretending we have no body, but about treating our body as worthy of care. The modern impulse is to hide everything, to pretend bodily functions do not exist, to create elaborate systems that whisk away waste invisibly, so we need never acknowledge it. Is this dignity, or is it denial? I do not presume to answer. But I know that the people I have known, peasants and nobles, monks and merchants, found ways to maintain dignity without such illusions. They acknowledged reality and met it with whatever grace they could muster. One aspect I have not sufficiently emphasized is how the changing seasons determined what was available and what methods were used. In spring, when new growth appeared, the world became generous. Tender dock leaves, fresh moss greener than any cloth, soft grass, all these appeared in abundance. This was the easiest season, when nature provided exactly what was needed in quantities that seemed limitless. Summer brought its own gifts: broader leaves, thicker moss, and most importantly, warmth. The discomfort of cleansing oneself was minimized when air was warm, and water, if available, was not agonizingly cold. This was the season when going to the privy was least unpleasant, when one could take time to be thorough without rushing back to a fire. Autumn was the season of preparation, gathering moss and grass, drying them for winter storage, cutting worn linen into squares, ensuring adequate supplies were laid up against the coming cold. Women knew precisely how much was needed to carry a household through winter, just as they knew how much grain or preserved meat would be required. Winter was hardest, cold that made every exposed moment an ordeal, materials that had to be stored inside to prevent them freezing into uselessness, the constant battle against snow and ice that blocked access to privies, the temptation to be less thorough simply to get back to warmth more quickly. And yet people managed. They always managed, because the alternative was unthinkable. I remember winter mornings when frost covered everything inside and outside the house, when breath formed clouds, when water froze in buckets overnight. On such mornings, the journey to the privy required genuine courage, or at least stoic determination, but it was made. The basket of dried grass was kept inside overnight so it would not freeze. Hands were warmed by the fire before and after, and life continued. Nature's provision changed with the seasons, and people adapted their practices accordingly. This required knowledge, foresight, and planning. It required understanding one's environment well enough to anticipate needs and prepare for them. This is another piece of knowledge being lost: the intimate awareness of seasonal cycles, of what the land provides and when. Modern life, with its year-round availability of manufactured goods, severs us from these rhythms. We are richer in some ways and poorer in others. I have spoken of settled life, of households and communities. But what of those who travelled? How did pilgrims and merchants, soldiers and wanderers manage on the road? I learned this myself during my years with Robert Fletcher. Travel meant unpredictability. You could not carry adequate supplies for a journey of weeks or months. You had to adapt constantly to whatever was available. Sometimes we stayed in inns that provided facilities similar to what we knew at home privies, with baskets of cloth or straw, sometimes even water for washing. Other times we lodged in rough conditions where nothing was provided, and we had to make do with whatever we could find. I learned to always be observant when entering new territory. What plants grew here? What did the locals use? Was there running water nearby? Were there smooth stones in the stream? The ability to adapt became a source of quiet pride among travellers, to never be caught unprepared, to be resourceful enough to manage in any circumstances. I remember once travelling through the mountains between France and Spain, we were caught by a storm and forced to shelter in a shepherd's hut for 3 days. The hut had no privy at all. We had to venture out into howling wind and driving rain, find what shelter we could behind rocks, and use whatever we could tear from our clothing or find among the sparse mountain vegetation. It was miserable, utterly miserable. And yet, we survived it. We maintained cleanliness as best we could. We did not surrender to despair or abandon all standards simply because circumstances were harsh. This, too, is dignity. The determination to remain human even when conditions try to reduce you to something less. Pilgrims often spoke of such hardships as part of the spiritual journey. That discomfort of the body taught patience and humility. That managing basic needs in difficult circumstances was training in resourcefulness and acceptance of what cannot be changed. There was wisdom in this. The road taught lessons that settled life could not. It taught that we are capable of more than we imagine, that the human spirit adapts, that what seems unbearable becomes merely difficult, and what seems difficult becomes routine. As I approach the end of my years and the end of this account, I find myself reflecting on acceptance, the wisdom of making peace with what is. Modern thinkers, I am told, speak of progress as an unqualified good, of each generation improving upon the last, of history as a march toward ever greater comfort and convenience. There is truth in this. I do not deny the value of improvements. Paper, when it becomes common, will make life easier for millions. Systems of sanitation will save countless lives. These are genuine goods. But what we lose in the process is also real. We lose the knowledge of how to manage without modern conveniences. We lose the connection to nature's provision. We lose the understanding that we are capable of dignity even in simplicity. More importantly, we lose the humility that comes from knowing our needs are not so different from those of our ancestors. That for all our advances we remain creatures of flesh who must eat and eliminate, who need warmth and cleanliness, who are vulnerable to disease and age. The people I have known, farmers and merchants, monks and nobles, people of every station and circumstance, understood this. They knew that managing the body's needs with grace and thoroughness was part of what made them human. They did not expect perfection, but they insisted on effort. This seems to me a wisdom worth preserving, even as we embrace the genuine improvements that progress brings. We should not romanticize the past. The cold was truly cold. The discomfort was truly uncomfortable. Disease and suffering were everywhere, often caused by inadequate sanitation and cleanliness. But neither should we dismiss the past as simply backward and ignorant. The people who came before us were as intelligent as we are. They observed, experimented, adapted, and passed on knowledge. They created solutions that worked within their limitations. They maintained dignity and humanity in circumstances far harsher than most of us will ever face. I am writing this in the autumn of my 78th year. My hand shakes, my eyes are failing. Soon I will see the winter, and likely not another spring beyond it. When I am gone, what remains of all I have witnessed? These pages, perhaps, if anyone bothers to preserve them. The memories of a few people who knew me, and nothing else. But the story itself, the story of how humanity managed its most basic needs across the centuries, that story continues. It is being lived right now by millions of people, most of whom give it no more thought than they give to breathing. We take cleanliness for granted until we cannot achieve it. We take paper for granted until we imagine a world without it. We take privacy for granted until we contemplate the communal latrines of Rome or the open privies of peasant villages. Everything we have was built by those who came before us. Every convenience stands on foundations laid by people who had less. Every modern comfort exists because someone, somewhere, decided that human dignity mattered enough to work toward improving it. This is what I want to leave with you, whoever reads these words in whatever distant future awaits, that civilization is not measured by its monuments or its conquests, but by how it treats the fundamental needs and dignity of ordinary people. The Roman who designed the flowing water beneath public latrines was building civilization as surely as the architect who designed the Colosseum. The woman who taught her daughter to select soft leaves was preserving knowledge as valuable as any book. The monk who maintained the monastery's water system was serving God as truly as one who illuminated manuscripts. We are all part of the same great effort, to be human, to be clean, to be decent, to care for ourselves and each other, despite the difficulties the world imposes. Would you recognize civilization if it had no paper? I hope now you would. I hope you would see it in the careful selection of materials, in the knowledge passed from generation to generation, in the determination to maintain dignity even in simplicity, in the quiet daily effort to care for oneself and others. That is civilization. That is humanity. That is what endures beneath all the changes of technology and comfort, beneath the rise and fall of empires, beneath the centuries that flow like water and wash away so much. I will not live to see it, but I believe paper will eventually become common enough that most people can afford to use it. The mills will multiply, the price will fall, and one day, perhaps, no one will remember the old ways. Children will grow up, never knowing how to judge the softness of dock leaves. They will not learn which moss is best, or how to store dried grass for winter. They will not understand why their grandparents speak of cold stone privies with a mixture of dread and pride. This is as it should be. Each generation is entitled to the improvements won by those before them. We should not require children to suffer simply because their ancestors did, but I hope someone, somewhere, will remember. Will understand that what seems primitive was actually sophisticated, that what seems dirty was actually an organized system of maintaining cleanliness under difficult circumstances, that what seems shameful was actually dignified. I hope they will look back on us with compassion rather than contempt, with understanding rather than mockery, with recognition that they, too, are only managing their needs with the tools their age provides, just as we did, just as our ancestors did, stretching back to the beginning of human time. And I hope they will understand this truth, which I have learned slowly across a long life, that we are united far more by our common needs than we are divided by our different methods of meeting them. That every human being who has ever lived has faced the same necessities, has sought the same comfort, has desired the same dignity. This is what makes us human, not our tools or our technologies, but our determination to care for ourselves and others despite all difficulties. Our insistence on cleanliness when it would be easier to accept filth, our preservation of knowledge across generations, our adaptation to changing circumstances, our hope that the future will be better than the past. These pages contain the memories of one old man who has seen much and understood little. But what little I've understood, I leave to you, that dignity is earned, not given, that wisdom comes from attention to small things as well as great ones, that every age does its best with what it knows, that we are all connected by our shared humanity, by our bodies and their needs, by our desire to live well in whatever world we find ourselves. I began this account by saying that civilization is revealed not in monuments but in humble daily acts. Let me end by saying civilization began not when we built cities or wrote books or conquered nations. It began when someone long ago decided that being clean mattered, that caring for the body was not shameful but necessary, that even in the most private moments we owe ourselves respect. Everything else, all the cathedrals and philosophies, all the art and science, all the great achievements we celebrate, rests on this foundation, that we are worthy of care, that dignity matters, that the small acts by which we maintain ourselves are as important as any grand gesture. This is the story of what people used before paper existed, but it is also the story of human ingenuity, adaptation, and the quiet determination to be decent in an often difficult world. I've told it as truthfully as I know how. I've tried to honour those who came before and those who lived alongside me. I've tried to show that they were not lesser than us, only different, shaped by different circumstances, meeting the same needs with different means. May their memory, and this account of their lives, not be entirely forgotten. May someone reading this in a future I cannot imagine understand that we were human too, that we lived with hope and dignity, that we did our best, and may that future reader know that someday they too will be the past, that what seems normal to them will seem strange to their descendants, that the tools they take for granted will be curiosities, that they, like us, are part of an endless chain of humanity, each generation building on what came before, each doing its best with what it has. This is enough. This must be enough. To have lived, to have witnessed, to have understood even a little of the great mystery of human existence. The rest is silence, and perhaps snow falling on empty ruins, and the slow turn of seasons, and the river flowing as it always has, carrying away what is left behind, making all things clean again. Here ends the account of what people used as toilet paper before paper existed, written in the year of our Lord 1325, by one who saw much and understood that even the humblest matters deserve to be remembered with dignity and truth.